when you talk to people who say, I don't like GMOs, I'm really against that, I think it's bad, and you ask them why, and then you start to talk to them about, well, we made this purple tomato. It uses transgenic technology, but it's putting a gene from an edible flower into this tomato to turn on a natural pathway. It has these nutrients that are in blueberries and acai berries and blackberries. People say, oh, that's really cool, but I didn't think GMOs did that. I love having these conversations because I can say, no, our product isn't any of those things. And almost universally, people say, okay, well, yours is a GMO I can get behind. This is something I really want. I can't wait to have it.
Hey, Karl, how you doing?
Hey, Erum, I'm doing great. How about you? You've had a very eventful week and we were gone for a week, so I think there's a lot to catch up on.
Yeah, I know. It's been a bit chaotic for me in my travels. I mean, the actual traveling I went to Canada for my husband's cousin's wedding, big Indian wedding. So lots of parties, 4 or 5 days in a row. It's exhausting. So I was really looking forward to coming back. I was coming back Sunday, but then our flights were canceled and they're canceled for like inclement weather, which was storms. And I know those storms resulted in floods. So we ended up getting tickets back that Tuesday. And what happened was, I mean, this is a public service announcement here, is that if you're flying anywhere, make sure to check in 24 hours beforehand, because if flights do get canceled, then you can rebook like the next day instantly. We didn't check in until like a few hours beforehand, and then we found out, and then we couldn't get any flights. They're all booked up until Tuesday. So we had 2 extra days in Canada, but we made lemonade out of that lemon, and we had a little bit of vacation, but trying to work the challenges that I had my toddler with me. So like I was daycaring it, trying to talk to you, Karl, about things. And needless to say, I'm happy to be back. I'm happy we have daycare. Thank you to the daycare teachers for taking care of them. You're so appreciated to me, because now I can have this call with you, Karl, without a baby screaming in the background.
Well, and I never mind the baby screaming in the background because he's never really screaming in the background. And I've lived through that, so I know it very well. So we had Canadian fires in May, June, where that turned the sky orange. We've had the hottest day in history just a couple of days ago. It's been like 100 degrees above the Arctic Circle. So the weather's crazy. I read a long piece by Bill McKibben in The New Yorker about how we still continue to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure, even though the world's on fire. Vermont, where he lives, has been declared a natural disaster because of the flooding there. I was lucky to make it back from the Adirondacks on Amtrak, I think last Saturday or so. But it was still like a bit of a pathetic experience because Saratoga Springs to New York City is typically a 3-hour train ride. It took about 4.5 hours because there was a bridge up. And then the subway in New York was delayed. So it took me another hour to get home. So it was not that pleasant. I know that it takes 8 hours on Amtrak to go from New York to Vermont. That should be a 90-minute trip. New York to Boston is a 4.5-hour trip on Amtrak. It should take less than 90 minutes. The infrastructure is pathetic. And I'm hoping that given the climate emergency, some of that stuff gets taken care of. But I'm glad you're back. I know you're also leaving again to a girls' weekend?
Yeah, what's up? Shout out to my Delta Phi Epsilon sorority sisters who I've been friends with since college. I am taking the Amtrak to Lancaster on Thursday. One of my friends lives around there, and then we're going to drive up to the Poconos. One of my friends has a lake house there, but hopefully I get there in one piece. A lot of my friends are teachers, or they work in another aspect of business, whether it's recruiting or real estate. And I was the only one of our friends that was really deep into the sciences. I was the only one that was a chemistry major or forensic chemistry major in my group of friends. Actually, not just my college friends, but even up to this day, I haven't met another forensic chemist that I'm really close with. Aside from that, they always ask me, like, what are you up to? Because I have had a very different career trajectory where I was in the lab for several years, and then I was an entrepreneur, whether it was working at a startup or starting a company. So I've been doing many different things. So they always ask me, what are you up to? So I wanted to tell them about Messaging Lab, our podcast, Biotech. And what I really want to ask them about is GMOs. Like, the first thing they think of. I am in my 40s. We grew up in the 80s and 90s, and GMOs were something that came up. So they might have a different idea of it because of what was being said in the media about genetically modified organisms, whether it was corn or tomato. And no, we'll be getting into that topic more.
Yeah, I mean, I think career trajectories are very interesting. I think they've changed a lot. I've been an entrepreneur for, I don't know, a long time. It feels like a long time. And now that Alejandro, my oldest son, is out there looking for a job, I think a lot about how I got the jobs that I had, how I started a messaging lab, how different people I know have gotten jobs, and how different it is, and how to help him and help help people like him who are looking to get employed. So I think it's fascinating to think about when you're around people who are not entrepreneurs, which is already like a very different kind of space because number one, it's very lonely. And number two, when you're in that space, it feels like, I mean, for us, we're around startup people all the time. We're around investors. We're around people who are really pushing technology forward. And we've done it both on the digital health side and in the biotech industry. So we see a lot of entrepreneurs. We live and breathe entrepreneurialism. But if you're not in it, you just have no idea what that is. And I think it can seem very strange to other people. It's lonely, it's scary, but it's also the most exciting, invigorating thing in the world to be involved in. So I think the GMO question, I think, is really important. And I think it'll be interesting to hear what they say. What I'm going to do is before I leave here today, I'm going to make sure that when I see you this afternoon, I give you one of Polybion's wallets so that you can have that with you to show off to your girlfriends and ask them if that changes their perception of GMOs. Since we're talking about GMOs or genetically modified organisms, let's use that as the segue into the introduction with this interview. Unfortunately, you weren't a part of this interview, Erum. I think that our listeners should get used to the fact that sometimes they're only going to get one of us, which is fine. We do a great job together, but we also do a great job separately. I'm super excited to introduce this interview with Nathan Pumplin of Norfolk Healthy Produce. We have tried their tomato. Erum, why don't you describe it and then we'll get into the interview.
Yeah, I first met Nate at SynBioBeta and he presented his purple tomato. And I actually was introduced to the purple tomato at Ferment. They had purple tomato there, but at SynBioBeta, Nate rolled up with purple tomato salsa and it was delicious. It was a deep royal purple color. Like there's some heirloom purple tomatoes, but they're like the light purple. This was like a dark purple. And I was like, wow, it's so eye-catching. And it was delicious. And we had friends from all over that were trying it, that are in our biotech community, people from Mexico that were like, this is really good salsa. So hats off to Nate and his team for whipping that batch up. So I'm just really excited to learn more. I'm sad that I didn't get to talk to him. He has a really great personality. That's the type of person that you want to be friends with. And you guys will understand what I'm talking about when you hear this interview.
Our friend from iGym, Danielle Dominguez Gomez, lives in Mexico City. Danielle said that it was the best salsa he had ever tasted, period. So coming from a taco expert from Mexico City, I think that is an amazing sign of greatness. So let's get into the interview. Hey, Nate, welcome to Grow Everything. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Karl. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I think you guys have some exciting news. So why don't we kick off the podcast by talking about the relationship between Norfolk Healthy Produce and the FDA? What's going on there?
Happily, Karl. Well, we just made an announcement yesterday. Of course, we've had this scheduled for a while, so the timing is fantastic, that our high antioxidant purple tomato product has completed the review with the Food and Drug Administration. And this is coming on the heels of our regulatory decision back in September from the USDA, and it gives us full green lights to commercialize our product.
So what does that mean? I mean, it's interesting because like the USDA 2 weeks ago approved these new cultivated chicken products, which I'm very excited about. And we've had some people on the podcast talk about that, but I haven't heard of any products like yours being approved in the recent past. Why don't you describe what the path to regulatory was and what does it really mean for you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the main differences is we are working with a biotech crop product. And so this is different from a food ingredient or something that's purified. The regulatory process in the US is what's called the coordinated framework. And this dates back to 1987 when we knew much less about biotechnology and there were a lot of open questions. The coordinated framework works between the Food and Drug Administration, the United States Department of Agriculture, and the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. And they regulate different facets of engineered crops or biotech crops. The USDA is looking at what's the plant pest risk? Is this something that could take over crops and become an invasive weed? For instance, could this have an impact on pollinators, et cetera? The Food and Drug Administration is looking at the safety for humans eating it and also for animals eating it. And then the EPA is looking especially at societal activities, what's called plant incorporated protectants. And these are things that could have a big impact on the environment.
Nate said cidal activities, and cidal activity refers to bactericidal, or the killing of bacteria, often measured for antibiotic efficiency. Considering that our Earth is covered in various microbiomes, the EPA wants to understand impact of how organisms interact, especially when it comes down to bacteria proliferating or dying out. Every organism has a role to play, in our complex ecosystem.
And Norfolk Plant Sciences, let me take a step back and give you the history of the company.
That'd be great.
We were founded back in 2007 by Professor Kathy Martin at the John Innes Center in the UK and Professor Jonathan Jones at the Sainsbury Lab right next door, also in the UK, both in Norwich. They had been doing groundbreaking seminal research in the field of plant biology, making discoveries in two critical areas. One, in nutritional fortification of food. What's the quality, what's the nutrition that we get from our food? And the other side, in disease resistance. How much food in a farmer's field is lost due to pests, due to pathogens that come in and destroy them? This has a huge impact in our ability to feed ourselves. It also has a huge impact in the sustainability of our farming, because if we lose a lot to diseases or we have to spray a lot of pesticides to save those crops, that has a big impact. So Kathy and Jonathan had made these seminal breakthroughs, and they had technologies and knowledge that could make huge improvements to the way that we're producing our food. But in order to use these discoveries, you really needed to use biotechnology. You needed to use transgenic approaches where you're taking typically a gene from one plant and putting those genes into another plant, where these can't be crossed through sexual compatibility. But there's this beautiful nature-based solution that allows organisms and also researchers to move bits of genetic material between organisms. And they had a lot of specific examples of great qualities that you could bring to crops using biotechnology. So they started Norfolk Plant Sciences in 2007 to try to take their knowledge, their discoveries outside of universities, outside of the ivory tower, and bring it into the real world and allow it to impact people's lives for the better. And so what's amazing, we started off this conversation on the regulatory path. 2007, they got started with the company, and it's basically taken from then up until now to have the full approval for the first product that can now go out to market just in the US.
That's amazing. That's a long path. So you guys are going to be marketing a purple tomato. And I seem to remember that one of the first genetically modified products was a tomato, the Flavor Saver tomato. But what I seem to remember about Flavor Saver was that, and this was developed, in the 80s sometime? It was developed for flavor and also for making it easier to ship the tomatoes. And I don't think that product ever took off. I feel like, in a way, it held the industry back because of its lack of success. Is that true, or is my memory serving me incorrectly?
So, Karl, everything you say is true. And I'm going to jump to one of the questions you had proposed, which is a biotechnology company that I admire. And Calgene, who developed the Flavor Saver tomato, they're at the top. They created so much of the knowledge and technology that we use today now for bioengineering, not just in plants, but in all organisms. They really pioneered, how do you do it? How do you do it well? How do you find targets? How do you find genes that you want to modify? How do you find traits that you want to add? How do you introduce those into crops? How do you select them? They created so much of that, and they were really pioneers. So in the business world, we often talk about, well, what is their first mover advantage, or actually is it a disadvantage to go first and you're better off to go second, third, learn from the mistakes and learn from the challenges that other companies face. And that's what I see about the Flavor Saver tomato. We've learned a lot. We've studied a lot that product and that process and also that era. And we have a new product in a new time that is meeting different unmet needs, but it's really following on the tradition that Calgene and the Flavor Saver tomato got started.
Yeah, I think for listeners who don't know that, Calgene and Flavor Saver, that all took place, again, I think in the late 80s. My timing might be wrong.
Started in the late 80s and the early 90s. Yep.
It was basically a generation ago, and genetic modification of plants was still very much something that was very scary. I think people are much more open to it now. I'm talking to you July of 2023. We've had some of the hottest days on record. It's clear that we've got a climate crisis happening. But why do you think we need genetically enhanced produce, and how it might be better than produce that you find in the grocery store?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do believe that we need to continuously improve the plants that we're growing, the way that we're feeding ourselves. And I think the climate crisis that we're experiencing today, which is top of mind for so many people and is so absolutely urgent, this is something that's different from the 90s when the Flavor Saver tomato was coming out. And let me give a quote, which I heard first from Howard Shapiro, who's a heavyweight in the ag world. We should really make sure that we're solving the problems of today, not solving the problems of yesterday, of 10 years ago, of 100 years ago. And I think what we look at today is climate climate, nutrition, food security, these are such absolutely huge challenges for our society. In the 90s, these were not such a big concern that people were looking at. People were concerned about pesticides. People were really concerned of where their food came from. And you're talking about the concerns about genetic modifications that a lot of consumers have. Let me cut to the end and say consumers see things very differently today. Consumers are very open to products like ours. They're very open to technologies as long as they understand a little bit how they're made, why they're made, what problems they solve. The problem is that those of us, even in the biotechnology industry, still think that consumers haven't changed their minds in 20 years.
That's true.
And the reason is we haven't been asking the right questions. If we ask the right questions, then we see consumers are very open to this. That's what we've started doing as part of Norfolk, and it's extremely refreshing. Let me just throw this piece in. So I've been working in the area of plant biotechnology for over 20 years. And this notion that, oh, consumers don't want GMOs, this really is tied to the 90s and early 2000s. And not only was there a crisis about pesticides then, there was a crisis of mad cow. There was a crisis of confidence, I would say, in regulatory bodies, especially over in Europe. There were these stories of the government saying, don't worry about mad cow, everything is fine, it's not a concern. And then all of a sudden, oh, it was a concern. And so I think there was a lot of consumers who had real reasonable reasons to have skepticism about the food that they're eating and the safety messages that they were given. And one of the key pieces as I think about what we're introducing, biotechnology got into our food system through plants, through animal feed. It really happened without the average consumer knowing it, without the average consumer having an opportunity to opt in or opt out. It was simply introduced in the food system and they found out about it years afterwards. And I think those of us who are at the innovation front, we think about early adopters, we think about laggards, and it's really important to walk up that technology curve with people's knowledge. The first order of biotechnology skipped some of those steps, and now we have the opportunity to really bring everyone along on our journey, and that's been very productive.
I think that you bring up a lot of interesting points, but one I'll point out is the way people start companies now is very different than they would have started even in the 90s, which is 30 years ago. And the way that company formation is taught now is solve a problem, go out and get your first customers, understand what your customers want. So I'd love to hear from your point of view, what kind of things did you guys do to get those early adopters on board? Especially since, I mentioned at the beginning, the USDA just approved this cultivated chicken. And for me, it was really revealing to go on a place like LinkedIn and just see all the trolls or all the negative comments just saying lab grown is terrible, I'll never eat this, and completely missing the point of the innovation. And I know that the cultivated meat space is very different, and it's kind of at that crossing the chasm point right now. It's like the progress has been made, funding dried up for a while, funding was very difficult, yet people continue to make progress. And now we're starting to see the beginning of precision fermentation in the meat space. So there has been a lot of work getting the consumers ready for that. What kind of work did you guys do to get the consumers ready for this purple tomato?
That's a great question and a great framing, Karl. What's interesting is we've been around longer than cultivated meat. And you mentioned the flavor saver tomato from the 90s, and there's other examples, whether it's golden rice, whether it's rainbow papaya, whether it is the Arctic apple. Consumers have known that there's GMO foods around. And even though most people don't necessarily seek it out and they have some concerns, there's at least a high level of awareness. And maybe in some sense, any publicity is good publicity at the end of the day. Because I think what we found was consumers know the term GMO, they understand biotechnology, they're interested in it, and it has a bit of a taboo quality. So our path for early adopters really started in 2008 when Kathy Martin published the first paper on the purple tomato. There were articles in The Guardian. There was a lot of interest because it was, okay, there's this new GMO crop that may come out. This is very controversial. And if it bleeds, it leads. So what we found starting 2 years ago when we began our regulatory process with the USDA is there was even more and more interest. So many of your listeners may know our product was featured on the front page of the New York Times Sunday magazine just exactly 2 years ago. And the title was Learning to Love GMOs. When consumers look at the pros and cons, the benefits of biotechnology, what it can do to solve the problems that we have top of mind that we touched on. And one of the things we did was we were very loud and we were very proud about our approach. We don't apologize for using biotechnology. What we try to do, and for your listeners, so I have a PhD in plant molecular biology. I've done a lot of research, but I've also tried to do a lot of communication to people outside of science. What I have found is when you talk to people who say, I don't like GMOs, I'm really against that, I think it's bad, and you ask them why, and then you start to talk to them about, well, we made this purple tomato. It uses transgenic technology, but it's putting a gene from an edible flower into this tomato to turn on a natural pathway. It has these nutrients that that are in blueberries and acai berries and blackberries. People say, oh, that's really cool. But I didn't think GMOs did that. I thought GMOs were injected with pesticides. They were monocrops. They were for big companies to sue farmers. Isn't that what GMOs are about? And don't they cause cancer? And I love having these conversations because I can say, no, our product isn't any of those things. And almost universally, people say, okay, well, yours is a GMO I can get behind. This is something I really want. I can't wait to have it. And partly we have a different story. We're a small independent company founded by scientists. We also have a product that is so different. It's so striking that people want to learn about it. They want to learn how it's made. They want to learn why it's different. And, Karl, you've seen the tomato and you've seen some of the events that we've done. So you've gotten the experience. One of the things I love the most is we'll go to, let's say, a meeting with a bunch of people who do biotechnology. And of course, the people who love biotechnology love the product. They think, oh, I can eat this thing that's been engineered. This is so fun. And it tastes great and it looks beautiful. But for me, one of the best parts is I'll walk across a room and the caterers who are serving food look at what I'm bringing by and say, what is that? Tell me about this. Can I try it? Can I have some? Can I take some home to my family? And to me, that's one of those things. The early adopters are seeing it. They're seeing it's something interesting. They want to engage in it. They're telling the stories to their friends. The next step for the early adopters is going to chefs, going to restaurants. So we've started that process already. What we're seeing is the adoption curve is going to be very quick for this product.
So we don't usually post the videos, but I do have a huge smile on my face. I've been lucky enough to try the tomato twice. I tried it at Ginkgo's Ferment, was impressed by it. But I think the place where it really hit me was at SymBioBeta, because you guys had created vats of salsa that were top notch. In fact, some of my colleagues from Mexico, one colleague in particular, Danielle, was so impressed, not only by the tomato, but by the quality of the salsa. So whoever your salsa chef was did a tremendous job. And Danielle actually runs taco tours in Mexico City. So he's a hardcore taco foodie. And I think that compliment to your purple tomato containing salsa is about as good as it gets. I love hearing that the reception, people want to see it. Of course we do. They want to try it. It's tasty as hell. I can't recommend it highly enough. And you're right. Genetically modified products are all around us. When I indulge in a bag of Fritos or Doritos, it says it right on the label, made with genetically modified products. And people are consuming those. As an aside, like we're working on another product, cosmetic product, where we're working educate the public on the label, because the label has to contain the name of the peptide, and the peptide includes what organism it's manufactured in. So it could be manufactured in E. coli or yeast. But the cosmetic industry wants you to label things in a way so that consumers understand, hey, this was made in yeast. Hey, it's a fusion protein. Hey, maybe it contains a fragment from a protein that comes from a cricket or something, just so that you have that understanding. And the concern is always going to be that there's going to be a backlash against it. So it's super interesting to hear how this came together. And I was wondering, could you maybe explain, you said there are pathways that turned on, there's part of a blueberry. I want to hear what was the process.
So let me pick up two strands there. So I'll get to your technical question next, but I want to touch on your point about the labeling rule and also weave in your point earlier about the comments that you see in discussion threads, because I think that's really critical. The labeling rule went into effect, and it's something that a lot of the industry was really fighting against. They said, if there's a label, people are going to see it as a warning sign, but there's no reason to have a warning sign, right? We shouldn't have a label. What we're seeing now that the labeling rule has went into effect, and it just went into effect last year, is people really don't care. They like to know that it's there. It's nice to see. For those people who really want to avoid genetically modified ingredients, you can get organic, you can get non-GMO project verified. And for everyone else, they see it and they think, okay, fine. And I've talked to a lot of people in the produce industry who have dealt with those questions. And so I think one of the biggest things in this industry when we talk about food is, what's the backlash going to be? The backlash is really concerning. So you have biotech companies who are making these products, but they need to break into the market and they need to convince the channels that this is a product worth supporting, worth carrying. And of course, there's heavy, heavy competition for shelf space for all products, non-biotech, biotech, whatever that is. To get in front of the consumer is a huge challenge in and of itself. And it makes a lot of sense that a lot of folks, especially in the retail industry, they're conservative. They don't want to take a risk. They've got lots of products to choose from. So why do something that may have backlash? And especially if they look at the comment threads on Twitter or any kind of article, you get the impression, oh my gosh, people are so against it. The fact of the matter is, and I feel like I always need to say this, the comment threads are not representative whatsoever of what the vast majority of people believe. We look at our consumer research data, and then I look at the comments that go in Twitter or LinkedIn posts, and it's simply, those comments are a very narrow view of some very strong opinions, but it's not representative. And what I think is really needed is to use the labeling, to use transparency to our advantage. People really want to know if things are new, how are they made? So I'll get to your question there. But as long as you explain carefully how it was done, why you've done it, then people can make a decision. I don't want it. I do want it. And we really love to be alive today, not 20 years ago, not 50 years ago, because we do have the opportunity to get our product out to tell that story. One of the other key pieces that we're doing is not just here's a tomato, do with it what you want. We're not only biotech and ag focused. And I want to give a shout out to Jessica Louie, my partner in crime here, who's done a ton of work to set the style piece up, to engage with chefs and restaurants. The chef Eric Minute, who made the salsa that you had at Symbio Beta, she brought him in. He did a fantastic job with that salsa, no doubt. And it's really important that we're not just saying, here's a piece of biotech, do you want to buy this? But here's an experience. Here's something that we all love. And it's enabled with this biotech. But we've added all these other pieces that really makes it fantastic. And we've mixed the old and the new. So that's still a little bit of how we get early adopters and how we bring people along on the journey. How did we make this tomato? So you've probably seen in the stores, and for your listeners who are gardeners, they've seen certainly purple skin tomatoes. The first prominent variety is called Indigo Rose. It was bred through conventional, traditional breeding at Oregon State University. Tomatoes can make purple pigments. It's the same pigments that are in blueberries. They're called anthocyanins, and they're typically made in the stems or in the leaves in response to ultraviolet stress. When there's too much light, it's a protectant. Some wild tomatoes will accumulate those pigments in their skin, but typically domesticated tomatoes, they've been selected for red and a little bit of yellow. So what Kathy Martin discovered was it's possible to activate the purple pathway. Instead of doing it by conventional breeding, you can do it with a biotechnology approach. And I assume most of your listeners are pretty familiar with how this works under the hood. So you have a pathway that makes a compound that makes this purple pigment. That's a secondary metabolite. That pathway is activated by transcription factors, by some kind of signal transduction cascade. In the wild tomato relatives, this is turned on in response to ultraviolet light.
Hey, Grow Everything listeners, let me explain what Nate was talking about. Cells have lots of processes going on simultaneously all the time. Cells digest food, cells eliminate waste, they are reacting to the environment, they're turning DNA into RNA, which makes proteins. All of these things happen through different pathways. And those pathways are turned on and off based on what's happening in the cell and what's happening in the environment around the cell. The purple color in the purple tomato comes from one of those pathways. Usually it is turned off. Nate and his team turned it on using transcription factors. Transcription factors are proteins that control how fast DNA makes RNA. They do this by binding to specific DNA sequences. So basically, Nate and his team engineered a pathway that makes the tomato purple. It's a pretty neat trick. It's pretty elegant. And let me know if you have any questions about this.
So conventionally bred purple tomatoes, this is done through wild introgressions. It means that you have a tomato that has a lot of weird DNA that hasn't been domesticated. So it doesn't bring in good qualities for eating. It doesn't bring in good qualities for farming, but it does bring in the purple. That purple needs to be activated by light. And this is a challenge for a lot of growing environments. And a lot of your listeners will have seen when you get a purple skin tomato at the store, the top is purple, but the bottom is red. And then when you cut it in half, when you see in the inside it's red. Kathy's big discovery was transcription factors that activate this pathway, not in response to UV light, but in response to development. So she took a process that was environmentally regulated and turned it into developmentally regulated during fruit ripening. So in our purple tomato plants, when the fruit first starts to form on the vine, it comes out, it's green. And when you grow tomatoes, typically they're green and then they start to turn orange. That's called breaker stage. And then they turn red. Our tomatoes are programmed genetically through development to turn purple instead. And so the transcription factors that come from Snapdragon that activate the pathway, those transcription factors are turned on by a tomato promoter, which is active during fruit ripening. So it's really a beautiful, elegant system of bioengineering. It's fairly simple by synthetic biology standard, but it's a beautiful example and it works extremely well.
So then how do you know when they're ripe? If it goes from green to purple, how do you know that it's ready to pick?
It's a great question. We had to dial this in. This was a big part of our process as we go from, okay, this is a science experiment and there's been a lot of testing done on the biochemistry chemistry, on the health effects in a rodent model. But if you're making a commercial product that needs to go through the supply chain, then we need to really dial that in. So the answer is it's a little bit later in ripening than you would think for a red tomato. So the purple color comes on slightly earlier than red, and the ripening is also slowed ever so slightly. So what we have learned, and we had to do a lot of trialing in our own hands to dial this in, is you look at the truss. So for those of you who have seen how tomatoes form, and you go to the grocery store, you get tomato on the vine. Sometimes you get cherry tomatoes on the vine where there's about a dozen tomatoes on a stem. Typically, the oldest tomatoes will ripen first and the younger tomatoes will still be green. So we can look at a truss and it's almost a snapshot in time where you see the young tomatoes at the front and the old tomatoes at the back. So you'll see green tomatoes, these aren't ripe. You'll see the first purple tomatoes. When you feel them, they're quite firm. Those are not ripe yet. And then you build that intuition really quickly of how many to count. Okay, here's the ripe purple tomato. They're soft. We do this mostly by tasting. You can taste how the bricks accumulates. You can taste how the fruit gets soft. It loses that vegetal flavor and gets just that beautiful umami mix of subtle sweetness with a little bit of acid, but just that full-on summery tomato flavor.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't think there's anything like a fresh tomato. And if I go to a farmer's market and someone is selling heirloom tomatoes, I will always buy them just because the flavors are tremendous and they do have, like you say, that great umami taste. But I think that there's this earthiness that you get. So I grew up in California, I live in New York now. My dad always has tomatoes in the backyard, but there is this earthiness to the fresh tomato that you don't normally get when you get a store-bought one. And I think it's super interesting to hear that tomatoes also naturally produce purple and that you guys just changed some pathways slightly to make these tomatoes purple. I think it's fascinating. It almost is like there is a rainbow of tomatoes that we usually don't have access to. There's so many species. And by the way, I've done deep dives on tomatoes. It is my favorite vegetable.
Well, it's certainly my favorite vegetable too. And one of the things that I think is really important to mention in what you just said, we love heirloom tomatoes. Different people have different definitions of what is an heirloom tomato and what's not an heirloom tomato. I think we'd all agree they've got to taste amazing. And you ought to be able to save the seed and replant it and get back the same tomato that its parent was. But taking a step back, if you think as a biologist, biodiversity is absolutely critical to give us whatever it is, whether it's an heirloom tomato that you really love growing and eating, or whether it's a new drug that's produced in a strain of yeast. As biologists, as people working in synthetic biology, we're constantly looking for that right mix of biodiversity to get us a certain trait, to get us a certain attribute. And when you look at the biodiversity that's out in nature, it's extremely grand. Yeah. It's huge. It's the product of millions and millions of years of evolution shaped by certain forces. But it is not the end-all be-all. There's constantly new biodiversity being created in the world around us. And of course, there's biodiversity being lost in the world around us. The loss of biodiversity is a huge concern. But I think I often get the question, not from you, but I often get the question from people, well, GMOs, aren't those a threat to biodiversity? Aren't we going to lose biodiversity because of biotechnology? And I understand where those concerns come from. And I do think it's important that we understand the nuances of different crops and the impacts that we're having on the environment. But I think at the end of the day, it really is increasing biodiversity. And I love your view of you have a rainbow of tomatoes. We often say eat the rainbow. And of course, we have a rainbow of produce. Right. We have a rainbow of foods that we eat. But even within tomatoes, you can have a huge rainbow of colors. You can have a huge rainbow of different nutrients. And I think that's one of the things that makes the world so beautiful. I think one of the things that makes our society so wonderful is sharing food together, having different meals, having your grandmother's favorite recipe that's been passed on for generations, and then mixing it with some brand new recipe with a new ingredient that you just came across for the first time last month. I love the way that Norfolk Plant Sciences and our purple tomato fits into this discussion.
Yeah, I love it too. I mean, I'll just mention, I don't think I've been to farmers market where people have a lot of different kinds of tomatoes. The thing that really blew me away many years ago was I went to Avocado Fest in Carpinteria, California, and I grew up around avocados. I grew up in Ventura. Half of Ventura is lemons, the other half is avocados, and there is a lot of tomatoes grown there. But it turns out that UC Irvine has the largest library of avocados in the world. And so at Avocado Fest, people from UC Irvine had brought this huge diversity. There was probably 80 or 90 different kinds of avocados, most you never see. And market forces basically have dictated that the two most popular tomatoes that we get, or two most popular avocados that we get, are Haas and then like another one that I never remember the name of because I don't really like them as much. But there's tomatoes that are the size of a walnut. There are tomatoes that are the size of almost like a small watermelon. They're all completely different. They have different flavors. I walked away with a couple of really big ones to bring back to my kids. But on tomatoes, the biodiversity is even greater than it is with avocados. But then this begs the question, are tomatoes vegetables or are they fruit?
Oh, I love that. Well, let me answer the last one first, and then I'll dive down your rabbit hole because that's what I love. Legally, according to taxation and nutrition in the US, they're a vegetable. Botanically, they're a fruit.
Interesting.
Easy. I think what you bring up, though, is so key. Your point about market forces. We talk about biodiversity. We talk about the flavor of heirloom tomatoes. You talk about 80 to 90 diverse varieties of avocados and how great they taste. You talk about bananas. Almost all of our bananas, a single variety, the Cavendish, it's susceptible to this devastating disease. And yet you can travel to parts of the world, like in India, where there's tons of different types of bananas and they taste so good, right? And you think, how could it be that we only have this one variety here? And I think there's two answers to this, which you've said already. There's the question of biodiversity and what are some better varieties? And that's really where Norfolk Plant Sciences got started, right? Let's make a new variety of tomato that's better and different in certain ways. But the market forces are so absolutely critical because those are setting the criteria of what crops can get out to market and what can't. And it's been interesting to see, especially in the fresh produce industry, how that's evolved over the last few decades. I'm in the camp of it is a miracle. It's the product of thousands of people working very hard, doing excellent work at their job, solving a problem, which is the vast majority of people, speaking for the US, for North America, they want to go to the grocery store any day of the week and they want to be able to buy most of the fresh fruits and vegetables that they regularly eat. And they may not want to think about what month of the year it is or what's in season or where things came from. I'm not necessarily that way. I really like seasonal. I like local. Most people do. But I think the market forces that have shaped what's available to us now are meeting the needs of the average consumer. And what's needed, I constantly think in innovation. Karl, I think you do too. I think most of your listeners do. What are the changes that we want to see in the world and what is it going to take to do? So there's a huge amount of synthetic biology and just biodiversity discovery work, development work that's necessary as an enabler. But at the same time, there's huge amounts of market forces that we need to address. Let me take us back to the flavor saver tomato and Calgene. The major failure of that product was in how it was brought to market. How was it produced? How was it distributed? What were the channels? What was the germplasm that the tomato was in? And the reason that our system works as well as it does today is because you have extremely competent plant breeders together with really great grower packer shippers, together with great distribution and logistics, together with great retailers. And this gets us the current produce that we have today, which is really astounding. Let me take a moment here and just think about COVID and think about in those early days, no toilet paper on the shelf. You could barely get a can of tomatoes, and yet the produce was still out there. And it's just a testament to how resilient the industry is. But everything is trade-offs. And so some of the trade-offs that we've made for that is having more shelf stability, longer supply chains. The way that you do that is reducing the flavor, reducing a lot of what we love about an heirloom tomato. You grow an heirloom tomato, it tastes great. You've got that umami, you've got that earthiness, you've got that richness. But if you leave it on your counter for 4 days, then you're too late. It's already rot. So most of the tomatoes that you buy in the grocery store, they've actually been bred through conventional breeding to not fully ripen. So they never develop the full flavor. What you get in exchange is much longer shelf life. And the new frontier for all of us who are working in the food space, whether it is cultivated meat, whether it's plant-based meat replacements, whether it's new produce items, how can we deliver a better consumer experience while also delivering sustainability, while also delivering a product that fits into the supply chain and is better than the status quo that we have today? And so what we're looking at is you need something that's distinctive, that's exciting for the consumer, something that's delivering a real benefit like nutrition, and something that has extra shelf life or enough qualities that can fit into the supply chain. And it's really hard to do. There's a good reason that we have one variety of banana and we have the Hass avocado. It may not be your favorite to eat, but it works really well.
Well, it is my favorite to eat when it comes locally, but it's not my favorite when I buy it at the grocery store. How's that for the answer? But I think just talking about supply chain and supply chain resilience, I think most of us, like you said, just take for granted produce that we have in the grocery stores. You never think about it, and unless you look at the label, you don't realize, hey, the bananas are coming from Panama and Costa Rica. These grapes are coming from Chile. These avocados are coming from Mexico and the Dominican Republic. It is a very robust global supply chain, and I think that it's also very fragile. And so given what we're going to see over the coming decades with climate, I could see the supply chains being disrupted in a way that doesn't necessarily have to be negative. It could be a very positive thing. And it doesn't mean that you won't be able to get your purple tomatoes, and I want to talk about how you guys grow them. Well, it doesn't mean that you won't get them in the dead of winter in Vermont. It just means that they won't be shipped, from Chile. They might just be being grown in Virginia or in a greenhouse in southern Vermont.
100% agree. So two pieces that I want to touch on with this. Let's start with the first piece, which is when climate change, as it gets worse, as we have more shifts in, okay, we've always grown tomatoes in these areas. Now the weather is not conducive to that anymore. So these areas need need to grow something different, and then we've got to grow tomatoes in another region. Farmers and growers are constantly adapting their mixes of what they produce, and this is just going to accelerate. One of the things we know is that if you move producing crop from one region to another, you almost always have to adapt new varieties. The day length is different, the temperature, the humidity, precipitation, all of the factors are different, and you really need to have varieties that are adapted to those regions. One of the things that we think about is, do you adapt based on evolutionary time frame? That can be very slow. How can you accelerate that? So you can add mutations, you can do speed breeding, but by adding in biotechnology traits, and this is an area where CRISPR and gene editing can come to play in a big way, but also adding transgenic traits, this can help in a huge way to adapt crops to new areas, to adapt to climate change. And I think the speed of adaptation is going to become more and more important in decades to come as climate change accelerates. The other thing that most of us don't think about, but I think once we talk about it, it's obvious, is plant diseases are extremely important. So think at one point we had no COVID-19, then we had COVID-19, all of a sudden, this is the most important thing. This happens in plants all of the time. So in tomatoes, in greenhouse production, it's a new virus called brown rugose virus. This has upended the industry because in most areas that are growing a lot of tomatoes, if you have susceptible plants, they're all going to be torched. So you can only grow varieties that are resistant to this disease. How do you develop varieties that are resistant? And this process through conventional approaches is quite slow and quite complex, and it takes a long time to get back a variety that's as good as the previous one. This is an area where biotechnology is proven. It can offer us immediate tools. Immediate to get the resistance that we need. The only sticking point is in the regulatory process. And I would say that the US and the rest of the world still has a lot of work to do to get the regulatory process in line with the actual risks that are posed and the relative risks of continuing on with the status quo. And we've seen progress in this area, and there's signs that I see to be encouraged. We could develop disease-resistant tomatoes very quickly. The slow and the expensive part is the regulatory process. It is important that we have a regulatory process. Let me be clear. It's really important that these new products are reviewed and they're safe for the environment, but we really need a regulatory process that allows these solutions to get to market in a reasonable amount of time. So that's my soapbox speech about genetics for adapting quickly to climate change and adapting us for the future. Now, you talk about the growth environment. How are we growing right now, and how do we see that in the future? And I think that's the other big lever that we can pull. So there's two main areas we think of. When you think of farming, you think of out in the field, big rolling hills. I'm from Michigan, I'm from the Midwest, so I typically think of corn and soy, but I love being in giant tomato fields as well. And I'm here in California in Davis, so we have a lot of orchards. This is still the cheapest place to grow. It's the most cost effective. You have free sunlight. Certain places you have all the water that you need. This will be the main place where the bulk of our calories are produced for many decades to come. But you mentioned CEA, controlled environment agriculture, or greenhouse production. This has become very quickly extremely important for food production, and it will continue to grow in its importance. And there's a few different ways of doing this. One is what you think of as a traditional greenhouse. It's glass or it's plastic. You walk inside, it's really bright, and there's massive greenhouse facilities, over 100 acres, growing tomatoes, growing cucumbers, growing peppers. A lot of what you get in stores come from these facilities, and they're extremely efficient. They're very well dialed in because of the market forces that we discussed. And this, I think, is really a positive development for the way that we produce food. There's another version of controlled environment ag, which is sometimes called indoor agriculture or vertical ag. And this is done without using outside sunlight. It's really a self-contained production environment. And I mention this because we're growing our purple tomatoes now in both of these environments. So we have some local growers in North Carolina and Kansas City who are growing in what's called medium tech greenhouses. We also have a greenhouse facility here in Davis, California, where we're doing yield trials, we're doing breeding, we're developing our next varieties and our next varieties and our next varieties of purple tomatoes and other products as well. I hope we get a chance to touch on that. This is really a phenomenal environment. We're also working with a leading company in the CEA space called Freight Farms, and they have been pioneers in the space of developing shipping container type grow environments. And what's great about these environments is they're quite small. You can put them anywhere. So you can put them in a food desert. You can put them on an island. You can put them in Alaska, in remote Canada, where it's really, really hard to ship in fresh produce. And of course, it's very expensive. It's not very sustainable if you look at the power that it takes. And you can look at Vermont in the wintertime, where you'd like to have some fresh produce and it's simply not possible to grow it outside. So Freight Farms and companies like them have done a fantastic job of building in grow recipes. Basically, basically, here's an environment, here's a climate that's ideal for producing the crop that you want to produce. So we really love working with different partners with different grow environments. We haven't been growing outdoors yet, but that's coming in the future. And what I believe, and we see this today in the produce industry, there is no silver bullet. There's no one size fits all solution where what works in Sacramento, California, works the same in Burlington, Vermont, works the same in Naples, Florida, works the same in Nineveh. It's really such a nuanced ecosystem of our food production. And I think it's something that defies the typical industrial mentality. Let's build a machine that works everywhere for everything. It's again a testament to the produce industry, how creative people are in pulling complex supply chains together. That's a piece that we really embrace. And we're really excited to join all of these other companies in the forefront of innovation, because this is what's going to meet our need. It's going to get, in many ways, I think, more complex, not simpler, as we look for ways to do more local production, more sustainable production, cut the food miles, cut the amount of carbon that it takes to bring us food.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this. What did you say? CEA? Is that what it's called?
CEA, Controlled Environment Agriculture.
Yeah, because I'd seen that, and I'm under the impression that this is the case, at least on the East Coast. Much of the lettuce, especially like the organic lettuce, organic spinach that comes in these plastic containers that you can see, and we buy it all the time. I think most of that comes from these controlled environments, because I saw a guy who is a founder of one of these companies, and I think they're based in Kentucky, though there are some local ones here in New York City. But this thing about doing more localized production of food, making it more sustainable so you cut the miles out, this is something I'm super interested in. And we've been doing a little bit of a deep dive on the cultured meat side, because we're curious, okay, what size bioreactor do you need to feed a city of 100,000 people, 1 million people? What does that look like? Those kinds of questions are on my mind. How do you make a city more resilient? How do you localize more of the food production? And the freight company that you mentioned is fascinating to me, because that basically means you can set these things up so that if we want a certain number of purple tomatoes in Vermont, we just get a couple of these containers in there while we build our facility or something like that.
Well, and you're absolutely right on, Karl. And that's been done already by many companies, and Freight Farms has a lot of farms at institutions with grower packer shippers, even, who are building out greenhouse facilities and they want something immediately. I think we're in a really interesting place. And the same goes for precision fermentation. What is it going to take to service a metro area? And can we have a distributed hub and spoke model that is really favorable? You
Right.
do the life cycle analysis, you're looking at all your emissions, scope 1 through 3, and you can say, look, we've looked at the metrics, we've looked at the data. This is better for the climate. This is more sustainable. I think that's where we all want to get. And I think our industry, let's say synthetic biology and everything it touches, is in the messy middle.
Right.
We are in the challenge of scaling. We are in the challenge of unit economics. We are in the challenge of consumer adoption. And in many places, so the controlled environment agriculture industry is in the middle of this right now. I think a lot of SynBio is, where we've been making promises for a long time. There's been some early successes, but a lot of us are still waiting to see the big breakthrough companies. So if you think Genentech with insulin,
Yeah.
I think you can look at Impossible Burger, maybe is the next one, that they really did it well. They did it a huge splash, and they sort of set the tone. Okay, this is a real new category of products. These are going to be strong. These are going to be growing. And now we're looking at, okay, controlled environment ag. How are the costs going to come down? How is the business model really going to work? What are the products that are going to come out? How is the consumer going to realize that these are different? So you recognize, okay, it seems like all my lettuce is coming from a CEA local farm instead of being shipped in from California to New York. And I think there's still a long way to go on this path. But I look with a lot of optimism to the history of solar power and wind power. A couple decades ago, it was, hey, this will never work out. It costs more to make these things than the energy they actually return. It's net negative. We shouldn't be doing this. And it took a lot of incentives and a lot of very ingenious, innovative private companies to step into that space, to drop the cost, to increase the productivity to the point that it really makes sense and it really scales. And I think we're at the forefront. We're just starting to break through in that area with synthetic biology. Pretty soon, this flywheel is going to be spinning. And then it's just going to be a question, okay, we have these distributed facilities for precision fermentation, for production of plants. Now, what's the best products to put through these? What do the consumers want the most? How do we keep getting better?
Totally. Now, you mentioned you guys are developing other products. Could you give us a hint as to what those are?
Absolutely. So the product that we have regulatory approval for is the purple tomato. You've had the purple cherry tomato, the snacker, and you had the salsa. These are the first two products that we're going to be testing on the market. So in a few small areas, these are already available. We're moving towards test markets in 2024 and then building out that product category with a bunch of different varieties of purple tomatoes. So we want the heirloom slicer. We want to make a purple tomato juice. There's a lot of other products that we can do based based on this technology where we already have the regulatory path.
Awesome.
Kathy Martin and Jonathan Jones, our founders, I mentioned earlier, they have a lot of innovations that they've developed through their basic research. And this touches on disease resistance, and this touches on other nutritional fortification, whether that's resveratrol, the healthy component that's in red wine, or vitamin D, which can be brought in with a gene edit trait, not even a transgenic trait. There's many other distinctive added nutrition traits that we can bring into tomatoes. And so that's very much in our future. And then we're already looking at other crops. So of course, we don't want to stop with tomato. There's a lot of other crops that have room for improvement. And so we're looking at the other crops that are grown together with tomato. That's cucumber, that's bell pepper. We're looking at some fruits. So we're looking at strawberry. There's a few other areas that we're just starting to get into. And one of the critical pieces for us, we've got to have a biological path where we can make something better. We need to have a product that's going to fit into the supply chain, as we discussed. But what's most important for us is the consumer. Their experience, is it something that they really want, something that they really need, something that fits into their life and makes it better? We really want to focus on those innovations that are going to make a splash with people and have people say, oh, what is that? I had dinner at Carl's house last night and he had this crazy dish with a purple tomato. I think he got it at Schnucks down the road. That's where we're going to go shop. We're going to pick this up. And we're really excited to do this, not just based on what can we do as biologists, but how can we mix the biological possibilities, the supply chain constraints to meet that consumer unmet need.
Yeah, I'm so excited. We had Evan Bear of Ecovative on a couple episodes ago, and Evan talked about My Forest Foods. I live in Brooklyn. I've got 2 supermarkets like a block away. And I was at one of the supermarkets and I saw that they had on the shelf, it said My Forest Food. And I was like, where is it? And the guy's like, oh, it's not here yet. And I was like, well, why are you guys advertising it? And then it was there a couple days later. So I bought some. But then I went to a coffee shop near my office, which is a few neighborhoods away from where I live. And the coffee shop was also advertising My Forest Foods. So I took a picture, put it on social. I'm very excited to see that. And that is a non-genetically modified, mycelium product. But I'm super excited to see your product show up on the shelves and to share it and to use it in the way that you exactly said. Now, I'm curious, do you think, okay, so we've got several organizations that are out there that that are independent organic certifiers. Do you think we need an independent pro-GMO certifier?
So, Carl, I'm so happy you asked that question. I think we don't need an independent pro-GMO certifier because in the US, the USDA is doing it for us, as they have done with organic as well. Let me dive into that rabbit hole, but give a quick disclaimer at the front. And as you mentioned, Edmund Bayer, who I'm a huge fan of, and I think My Forest Food, and I don't care that it's not GMO. I am not one to say everything should be GMO. It is certainly not the case. It's not a silver bullet. What I think is we should be trying to make the world around us better all the time. And we should use the tools that we have available that are safe, that get the job done that we need. And there's so many tools in our toolbox if we think as being biologists, as we are people who are making food, who are solving problems. And, biotechnology and especially transgenic technology is just one of those. We can do a lot without that. We can do a lot with it. Now, your point about do we need an agency or a certification for pro-GM? Carl, I'm on the industry advisory group for the USDA's agriculture marketing service. So we had a meeting all together with this group, and it's really a fascinating, diverse group. You have a couple people who are in a little bit the biotechnology space. You have a lot of people who are in the traditional fruit and veg supply chain. You have people who are running food hubs, local distribution centers to connect local growers with local consumers. It's really a huge diversity of perspectives of areas of the industry. And we had a lot of presentations on the USDA's organic program, and they have a really big focus on enforcement. How can we make sure that something that carries the organic label is really organic? 100% of the ingredients went through there. That's their big focus. We then had presentations from the people who do the bioengineering labeling. This looks very similar. Have you seen the bioengineered label?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
So it looks very similar to the USDA organic. USDA put this out. They said, here's how we're doing to make sure that anything that is bioengineered has this label. So we're going to make sure if it's bioengineered, it has to carry the label. The organic is the opposite. We're going to make sure if it has the label, it really is organic. So I raised my hand and asked the question, so if something has a bioengineered label, but I think maybe it's not bioengineered, what do I do about that? How do we make sure that it really is bioengineered to carry the label? And the people laughed and they said, why would anyone want to do that? There was a belief even from the USDA that bioengineering is a warning label. Organic is not a warning label. Organic is a premium label. Bioengineering is seen as a warning label. So my belief, and this is one of my big, hairy, audacious goals, is 5 years from now, and I don't think it's even going to take that long, the bioengineering label is going to be a premium signal akin to the organic label. And we're going to see this plastered on products, and people are going to be picking it out and they're going to say, hey, I love this product. It's better through bioengineering. It's not because it was bioengineered, but the thing that I love about this product, it has extra antioxidants. It looks beautiful. It tastes great, was enabled by bioengineering.
Yeah, I'm with you. I want that to be the big goal. And it's super interesting to me because it's like doing work in the beauty space. One of the areas of growth is green beauty. And then you see people talking about natural beauty. And then you get into this whole thing about, well, natural, and we've done this in biospace, where natural doesn't mean what people think it is. People think natural means, oh, it comes from a plant. But then they don't realize you can have something that's natural, but that is produced in E. coli or yeast, and it's the same ingredient. But then people will say, oh, but that's synthetic. Well, no, it's actually the same. So you start to get into these arguments about what is natural. And so I find this idea of putting that bioengineered label on something as the premium, I think people are going to start to realize that there's so many benefits to things being bioengineered, like all these things you're talking about, nutrition, about sustainability, about durability, about shippability, local production. All those things are embodied in that bioengineered label.
I love that point. And people might think, oh, bioengineered is not natural. It's the opposite of natural. And this word natural is quite a weasel word.
It is.
I want to give a shout out to Jonathan Jones, one of our founders, who I think I might have first heard him mentioning this on a recording of the Ali G show about 20 years ago, where he talks about, this natural thing is such a weasel word. And if you get sick with an infection, the natural thing is not to take antibiotics. The natural thing is to die. There's a lot of things that are unnatural in our society, in our lives, that we take for granted. And I, for one, am pretty grateful for.
Yeah, natural can also mean deadly. Plants produce many poisons to protect themselves.
Yeah, and it's important for us to have that context. Again, I think a lot of consumers are very astute now. If you think in the 90s, when this natural phrase came into fashion, it was counter-positioning against this deep industrial, synthetic, artificial, maybe picture the cheapest TV dinner or something. And that counter-positioning really worked. But now it's sort of run its course. This is my perspective. Now there's an opportunity to say, all those things that you like about natural, we can do that, but we can add bioengineering on top. There's a professor at UC Davis, Pam Ronald, who's in plant biotechnology. She wrote a book called Tomorrow's Table, which outlines a case of taking organic farming methods, combining them with biotechnology methods, and coming up with a food system that takes the best of all of these worlds. And that, frankly, is my vision for the future. I think dogma is not very helpful for us. I think science, I think data, I think critical thinking and creativity is really what's going to bring us forward, whether it's new ways of producing our food through agriculture, whether it's precision fermentation for food, for beauty products. I really think it's important that we look carefully at the dogma that we're adopting. We look carefully at what are the resources, what are new ways that we can reframe the problem, what are new ways that haven't been tried, and how can we pull these together and weave them together in a way that does it better. And I, for one, am encouraged if we can get beyond these notions of natural, of organic. The term of art now is regenerative, which is still being defined. And I think what we agree is the objective is sustainability. The objective is health and nutrition. The objective is equity. It's accessibility. It's fairness. And are we really doing the best that we can to get to those objectives? And I think I'm encouraged by people. Stuart Brand, for instance, had a great book called Whole Earth Discipline, where, he said, those are my objectives. In the 60s, I thought the answer was no GMOs, no biotechnology, no cities, everyone back to the land. Now I'm looking at the data out there, and the data are painting a picture. No, actually, people are more efficient if they're in cities. If farming is done at scale efficiently, this is a path forward. And so I'm encouraged, honestly. I'm optimistic that there's more of these discussions. There's more people willing to turn conventional wisdom on its head, not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but really think, what are we all trying to accomplish? What are the tools? What are the resources? What are the new ideas? What are the traditions that we need to honor? Who do we need to bring on board? How do we get representation of everyone who's out here, all of the stakeholders? And I think if we can really lean into this and keep challenging ourselves to do better, the future is bright.
Yeah, I agree. I want to be very mindful of time. Nate, is there anything that I didn't ask that you think we should have covered? This has been such a fantastic conversation, I have to say.
Nothing pops to mind, Karl. I know we'll have to do this another time because there's so many rabbit holes we could have gone down that we didn't. But I'm really encouraged by the response that I've seen from so many communities, from the synthetic biology community, from the ag community. And I think that's more and more important for us to be telling our story, but also showing what it connects to and representing the larger context. So I really appreciate your invitation to speak to you today, and I look forward to more.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. We'll have you on as a regular. I want to hear more about your progress. Everybody should be looking for the Norfolk healthy produce purple tomatoes in their grocery stores as they become available. I highly recommend them. Nate, thank you so much. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much, Karl. Appreciate it. Have a great one.
You too. All right. So, Erum, what do you think of that interview?
I'm so blown away about this. I mean, there's so many topics that were covered. I really wish that I was there to talk to him, but you covered it perfectly. Like you and I have a hive mind. When Nate was talking, I was like, I want to ask him this question. You came right in, asked the exact question that was in my mind. So that's perfect.
Thank
you. It
you.
was perfect. Yeah, thank you. I mean, like this is what happens when you work together, I suppose.
Yeah.
So there are a few things. Like, first of all, let's just get to some of the things that were related to what we do on the daily, right? So I really appreciated the fact that when he was just talking about the tomato and his work, he's a CEO. He is trained on how to speak about his product. And it is a very delicate situation because there is some genetic modification happening. But the way that he said it was there was a mixing of genetic material. I don't think he mentioned breeding, but breeding and introducing this genetic material to this product, I thought was a really great way to talk about this type of process. I don't even want to say technology anymore, to be honest with you, Karl, because technology is often seen as something that is cold and computers and like not biology. But I really appreciated the fact that at parts of this interview, Nate was positioning the tomato as a flavorful biological product. It was just great because you and I and our team here at Messaging Lab, we're always thinking of ways to talk about biology and biotechnology in a way that is friendly and welcoming. And even if you look in the Oxford Dictionary, it's a horrifying definition for biotechnology. It's like the manipulation and exploitation of biology. And I'm like,
wow.
All right, relax, Oxford Dictionary, relax, right? Like, let's just reframe this. Mixed genetic material sounds better. It is also accurate. There's a nature-based approach here. We're not thinking about silicon and changing the DNA structure into something that's silicon-based versus carbon-based. Like, let's relax. So I did appreciate that about Nate's commentary.
Yeah, I'm super excited for more products like this. And I think that towards the end of the conversation where Nate was talking about how the bioengineered label has been looked at as a warning, whereas the organic label has been looked at as a premium. And he believes the same for organic over the next few years. I think that's totally going to be true. There is no doubt. And one of the things that I want to do is go back and read the New York Times article about them, which is a couple years old. I will make sure that we link that in the show notes. We started the conversation talking about Flavor Saver, one of the very early genetically modified products. That was in the 80s. It's 40 years ago. Things have progressed so much faster. And, at the beginning of our commentary, we talked about the heat and the climate. And I always joke around and I always say it, and I'm totally serious. We need every solution everywhere all at once. And I see the stuff that Nathan and his team are doing is just a part of that solution. There's a lot of other solutions that we need. I think it's also just worth reminding the audience that there is a difference between transgenic and gene edited. The difference is that transgenic means that the organism, could be a plant, could be an animal, has some new genetic material inserted into it from an unrelated organism. So that's something that when people used to think about GMOs, that's really what they were talking about, was a creator of transgenic organisms. I don't think that the fear of that is as overblown as it was 30 or 40 years ago.
I remember back in the 80s or 90s that there was propaganda where there was a fish on a tomato to like comment on the flavor saver. And I was like, a fish being mutated or like being implanted into the tomato, right? This was how bizarre people were thinking about it.
I don't remember exactly. We'd have to look it up. But I think that there was a gene that prevents them from freezing, which was inserted into the tomato. But again, I might be totally wrong. So the other thing that Nate talks about is gene editing. So we talked about transgenic, and gene edited means what you're doing is you're taking the existing pathways that are in the organism, and you're turning things on or off. Biology is pretty complicated. There's a lot of, depending on the developmental stage of an organism, genes are turned on and off naturally, but using new gene editing technologies, you can manipulate when certain genes are turned on and off. And that's really important because, like, for example, for these guys, as Nate mentioned, there are purple tomatoes or partly purple tomatoes. So if they turn off or turn on a pathway, they can make the tomato completely purple. We'll have to look into a little bit more detail and we'll include that in the notes. As we sign out or get ready to say goodbye to this episode of the pod, I think there's a couple things we should just mention. We want to give a shout out to our friend Michael Kopke at Lanzatech. He is changing his role. And so congratulations, Michael. We're super psyched for you. We can't wait to see you again soon.
Yeah. And then we have a lot of friends that are entrepreneurs. They're founders of companies in our space of biotech, and they recently closed rounds of funding. We should check in with our friends to make sure that we can announce it. But once we check in with them, we'll let you know who they are. Great great feat. It's one of the most challenging things about being an entrepreneur is raising venture capital. So you know who you are. Congratulations to you. We will see you soon, and we'll talk about announcing your successful closing of a round.
Okay. And then you put this note in our notes, Erum, where you say we need a hotline so people can call and text us. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think we do. So for example, let's say one of our friends, Alex Rose, for example, like he's listening and wants to chime in on something. Why can't someone just like text us? And I know right now you can check your Spotify, if you're listening on Spotify, there's a question there where you can answer that, but that's a little bit more one way. But if someone had something on their mind while listening, let them like text us. I know that our friends at the Pivot podcast, they're not our actual friends, but we love Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway. They have a phone number. So that's all that I was thinking about is maybe we could be like, hey, any thoughts or ideas, text us at 444-444.
Right. I also want to just say thank you. I don't have the name of the last person who reached out and told us how great our podcast is, but there have been a few people who've been reaching out via LinkedIn or emailing me directly. So I just want to say thank you. Next time we record, I'll make sure I just give you guys a shout out because we do appreciate all the compliments, all the comments, all the suggestions. We've got a bunch of great episodes in front of us. Unless there's anything else, Erum, I think that's the pod.
Yes, that is. We will see you next week.
Awesome.